I have a bit of an unconventional hobby. I love to make technology bend to my will, and I'm a firm believer that the incredible computing power we use every day is vastly underutilized by software that just doesn't take advantage of everything it can do, and I like to figure out everything tech can do. Guild Wars 2 is, as we all know, only available for good old-fashioned beige box Windows PCs, but that doesn't mean that's the only thing it can run on. If you have a Mac, or if Microsoft's dystopian spyware hellscape is pushing you towards Linux, we have options. And that brings us to today's video, how to run Guild Wars 2 on Mac and Linux. Since I'm guessing the majority of people who clicked on this video did so because they have a Mac, we'll start there. Apple freely distributes the BootCamp installer, which guides you through partitioning your hard drive, installing Windows, and installing the Windows drivers for some of the more specialized Mac hardware. When booted into Windows, your Mac is, for all intents and purposes, a generic Windows machine. I won't spend much time on this because there's no trick, it's just installing Windows, but I will link to Apple's guide for this. Also, I'm borrowing this MacBook. Dual booting is ideal if you must have add-ons, specifically Blish HUD, but if that's not an absolute requirement for you, I think most people will agree they'd rather not have to reboot every time they want to play Guild Wars 2, or devote a good 100 gigs or so of storage to a Windows install for just one game, let alone pay for a Windows license just to do all this. So that brings us to the wonderful world of Wine. Wine stands for Wine is not an emulator. Don't ask questions. You see, back in the olden-timey days, if you wanted to run software from one operating system within another, you had to emulate an entire PC in software, which is cool, but not that performant. That has evolved a lot over the years, but it's still not my favorite solution, and it's not great for gaming, so we're not going to talk much about it. But Wine, on the other hand, is again not an emulator, it's a compatibility layer. This means it's basically a collection of libraries, runtimes, and other complicated software tricks that give Windows applications everything they need to execute on a non-Windows operating system. Wine is great because it has very little overhead. Unlike emulation, software is running about as natively as possible, which means there's very little performance hit, and in some cases, some games can actually run better in Wine. But Wine is not the most user-friendly package by itself, unless you like playing around in terminal. For Intel Macs, the best application I've found is called Crossover. It's basically a polished commercial version of Wine available for several platforms. It's not free, unfortunately, but it's the only one that's regularly maintained and actually functions well today, and there is still a free trial, so you can give it a shot before deciding whether or not you want to buy it. If you don't want to pay for Crossover, you can try PlayOnMac, which takes a similar approach to Wine, but for free, or the official Wine builds from WineHQ. However, I couldn't get PlayOnMac to run the game on this machine, though it has worked on other machines for me in the past. First, download and install Crossover Mac. I'll include a link in the description below. Drop it into your applications folder, fire it up, and let it acquire all the necessary permissions it needs. You actually can just search through its library for Guild Wars 2 and directly install it from there. The first time I did this, it threw a few errors during installation, but ultimately it did still work fine. After it creates a bottle for the game, it will let you launch it, and from here, it's just a matter of logging in and patching the game like usual. On a 2018 MacBook Pro, I found performance to be pretty bad, which speaks more to the hardware specs than anything. However, part of what makes Wine work for modern games is by translating DirectX instructions to other libraries like Vulkan, which is taxing, but also Vulkan does cache shaders as it runs, so performance improves as you let it build its shader cache. Let the game fully patch, and even on older hardware, it can be playable. Now, if you have a Mac with Apple Silicon, the process is largely the same, but instead we're going to use a different spin on the Wine project called Whisky. Get it? Wine? Whiskey? Please clap. First, download the Guild Wars 2 installer from ArenaNet's website and just set it aside for the moment. Then, download the Whisky app from the official website, link in the description, unzip it and toss it into your applications folder. Then fire it up and it will prompt you to install Wine libraries and just let it do its thing. Then create a bottle, which is kind of just a container for the Windows app to live in. It will take a minute or two to finish, and once you see the spinner stop spinning, just click Run. Then select the Guild Wars 2 installer you downloaded earlier, and the rest is basically going to be the same as installing it on Windows. Just proceed through the installer, let it download, and fire it up. If the game crashes after you launch it, go into the bottle settings for the game and make sure DXVK is enabled. This is what translates DirectX 11, so it's a requirement, but it might not have been enabled by default. What makes this even possible is that Whisky implements Apple's game porting toolkit and can handle the translation from Intel instructions to Apple Silicon. But doing so is basically a form of emulation, which does add quite a bit of overhead. But Apple Silicon is also really good at it, so performance should be perfectly fine. Even with medium to high settings, I was consistently getting around 45 to 60 FPS on this M2 MacBook Air, though keep in mind performance drops if you're running off battery power and not plugged in. One final note before we move on from the Mac side of things, this will really only work if you have a traditional ArenaNet account. The Guild Wars 2 client does have a launch argument to specify if you're using an ANET or a Steam account, but it doesn't replace the Steam login, so it can't really be used to bypass the Steam launcher. Steam does have its own wide implementation called Proton for Linux, but it's not available for Mac. So as far as I know, it's just not possible to use a Steam account for Guild Wars 2 on Mac, short of dual booting or running a whole-ass virtual machine, which is going to be pretty slow. Now, if your machine doesn't have enough horsepower to run the game well enough for you, then stick around because I'll discuss some streaming options after I talk to the Linux gang. If you're running Linux, you almost certainly already know what dual booting is, so we're not going to talk about that. But just like on macOS, Wine is definitely the way to go here. First, if you do happen to use a Steam account to play Guild Wars 2, just install Steam. The end. That's the whole video. Kinda. Valve has contributed a lot to the Wine project in recent years, and their implementation is called Steam Play, but most people refer to it by its internal designation Proton. After you install Steam, you will have to go into the settings menu, then compatibility, and flip the toggle to enable Steam Play for all other titles. Then you can just install Guild Wars 2 through your Steam library like normal, easy peasy. If you'd like, you can also use Steam to play with an ArenaNet account. Just install the game, click the gear icon, then settings, and add this line to the launch options field toward the bottom. If you use an ArenaNet account and you want a cleaner installation or you don't want to have to fire up Steam every time you play, I use an application called Lutris. It is yet another Wine implementation, and it actually gives you the option to run your games using the vanilla Wine library, Valve's Proton, and several other Wine-based runners. Like Whisky for Mac, Lutris is super easy to set up, and in fact even officially supports Guild Wars 2 out of the box. Once you get it installed, just click the plus button in the top left corner, click the first option to search Lutris for installers, and search for Guild Wars 2. Lutris will take a minute to set up the wine bottle, otherwise known as the prefix. Then just proceed through the game's installation like normal. Lutris will even create a desktop file for Guild Wars 2 so you can launch it like a native app, and frankly, it pretty much feels like it is. In fact, I found I actually get slightly better performance running Guild Wars 2 through Lutris than I do on Windows, probably just because of the lower overhead of the operating system. If you don't need Blish HUD, Guild Wars 2 on Linux is as good as gold. There's one more platform I want to talk about running Guild Wars 2 on, and that's Android. Yep, like for phones. Now, this is mostly a proof of concept and not something I'd recommend trying to actually play on, plus it's pretty technical, so this will be a bit of a condensed version, but here you go. We're going to use an emulator called Horizon EMU. This combines Wine libraries with DXVK, just like on Mac and Linux, along with Box86 and Box64, which are used to translate x86 code to ARM. There are actually a few different software packages out there with similar goals, like Box64 Droid, Winlator, and Mobox, but I found Horizon to be the most complete and the only one that actually worked. This will require a pretty recent and pretty beefy device. I would probably say no less than a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and this was all done on my Galaxy S23 Ultra. So first, sideload the Horizon EMU app, and of course I'll link it. The instructions page details how to install it, so I'll just go over some of the important stuff. From the Downloads tab, first tap Update All and let it download all of the required packages. You're also going to want to install the Scripts package and Wine 9.3 Vanilla. Once that's all installed, go over to your Containers tab and tap Create New Container to set one up. Then tap the Settings button for your new container and make your settings match what you see here. I had the best luck with Turnip Driver V7, and the rest I basically took the most recent version of. There are a ton of options in the main settings page regarding how you handle mouse and keyboard input, emulated trackpad input, and more. But I'll be plugging in an external monitor, keyboard, and mouse for my example. When you're all done, return to the Containers page and tap File Manager at the top, and then wait patiently while it spins up an emulated Windows desktop. Now, if you were to download the official Guild Wars 2 installer to your device, you can launch it and it will attempt to install. However, I found the installer constantly hangs and quits downloading while trying to patch. So I ended up copying over a complete Guild Wars 2 install folder from a Windows machine, including a fully patched gw2.dat file. Make sure this is a vanilla install and not one with Reshade, Arc, or other add-ons installed. Don't push your luck. Using the file manager, the D drive is mapped to your phone's downloads folder, and I'd recommend copying the game over to the emulated C drive somewhere. And honestly, that's pretty much it. With one exception, I could not for the life of me get keyboard input to work. It works in an emulated notepad, but even the Guild Wars 2 launcher just doesn't seem to know it's there. So I actually had to copy and paste my credentials from the emulated notepad. Your mileage may vary here, it may very well be device dependent, and I'll continue to experiment with it. But once you're logged in, click play and cross your fingers. I was able to get in-game and run around a bit, and I even got somewhere between 15 and 30 FPS depending on the environment. This project has a long ways to go in terms of stability, compatibility, and performance, but holy script, what a time to be alive. Alright, let's talk about alternatives to running the game natively on your machine, i.e. streaming. If you're not familiar with game streaming services, it's exactly what it sounds like. The game itself runs on a remote computer or a server, and the video is streamed to your client while your inputs are sent to the server. There are a few advantages to streaming. For one, because the game is running on a remote machine, the client you're using to play it doesn't need to be powerful enough to run the game, it just needs to be powerful enough to stream the video, and practically anything can do that. This also means that your client could be portable, and when compared to running the game on a gaming laptop, for example, it means you would get way better battery life on a machine running cooler and quieter. The main downside to streaming is that it requires a way better internet connection than playing the game natively. You basically need enough bandwidth to be able to stream high bitrate HD video with no stuttering and lightning fast latency to minimize input lag. That alone makes streaming a non-starter for many people, but if you have a solid internet connection and need an alternative to running the game natively, it is definitely worth considering. Streaming services are also, in general, going to be a lot more platform agnostic than running the game directly, but that will depend on the service, so let's talk about those. The most easily accessible option is NVIDIA GeForce NOW. It's the only option officially supported by ArenaNet, and it's a cloud streaming service, meaning the machine you're connecting to is part of a giant server farm. The advantage to this is that you can run GeForce NOW on practically anything. GeForce NOW's virtual or remote rigs are also pretty beefy in terms of specs, so it makes a great option to be able to crank up the graphics fidelity higher than what your own machine might be able to do anyway. But there are some downsides to GeForce NOW. For one, it's a freemium service. There is a free tier, but when you start it up, it puts you in a queue for the next available rig. So sometimes there can be a long wait just to get in game. It also only lets you play for a single consecutive hour. Once you hit the hour mark, it kicks you off, though you can immediately re-enter the queue and join, and it often keeps your instance the same. So your game may not even disconnect. Still annoying. Second is, unless you pay for it, GeForce NOW will not save your game settings, and it always resets when you log in. Additionally, because it's a remote machine that logs out when the game isn't running add-ons like ArcDPS or BlishHUD is damn near impossible, and pretty much not practical at all. But if you like GeForce NOW, paid tiers start at $10 a month, and it's worth subscribing if you plan to be using it a good amount. And finally, let's say you do have a gaming PC that can run Guild Wars, but you still want to be able to play on another computer like a MacBook or a laptop that might not have enough horsepower to run it natively. Well, local streaming is also an option. There are a lot of ways to pull this off, but my favorite is an app called Parsec. Parsec is basically a turbocharged remote desktop application. It's free and really easy to set up. Just install Parsec on both machines and set one to be the host and the other to be the client. One thing I really like about Parsec is that you can set it to change the host screen resolution, so even if your host uses a weird screen size like this thing, it will automatically kick over to a resolution of your choice when your client connects to it. Parsec has a good amount of options to really fine-tune your experience, and it's cross-platform, so it will work on Windows, Linux, Mac, and a lot more. An alternative, at least if you have an NVIDIA GPU, is the combination of the apps Sunshine and Moonlight. Sunshine is the host, which you'll install on your PC, and Moonlight is the client, which is available for damn near everything with a screen. I don't find it quite as user-friendly as Parsec, but performance is good and it's super lightweight. You can even use Moonlight on a tablet or a phone. Obviously, this is still Guild Wars we're talking about, so of course you'll want something you can actually see and that you can hook up a keyboard and mouse to, but it'll work. One more advantage to local streaming is that because you're connecting to what I presume is a full Windows PC, you still get full add-on support for things like BlishHUD and ArcDPS, since they run natively on the host machine. And speaking of add-ons, let's talk about those real quick. I'll say up front, ArcDPS works perfectly fine on Linux. Just drop the DLL into the Guild Wars 2 folder like you would on Windows, and you're done. On Mac, I couldn't get Arc to work. It would load as far as the character select screen, but the game would crash whenever I tried to load into a map. Raidcore's Nexus add-on, however, does work fine on both macOS and Linux. If you aren't familiar with it, Nexus is an add-on that basically seeks to replace the old Guild Wars 2 add-on loader and could potentially fill the same role as BlishHUD as a provider for in-game add-on modules. I still couldn't get Nexus to load ArcDPS on Mac, but it worked flawlessly on Linux. Nexus is still fairly early in development, but it has a growing library of add-ons, and because it renders in the game engine, it's already cross-platform. BlishHUD is mostly unusable on non-Windows machines, unfortunately. This is because BlishHUD is a separate, standalone application that draws a transparent window in front of the Guild Wars 2 game window, and then it draws its application window and features there. Unfortunately, while BlishHUD will load in Linux via Wine, it can't draw transparently over the game window like it would on Windows. This is because of the Win API crimes they're committing to produce transparency. Their words, not mine. If you're using KDE, you can set up some Windows rules to always draw BlishHUD on top, never steal mouse focus, and draw at 50% opacity. But then you have to compensate for it by cranking up the gamma with the in-game slider. But you still get a weird washed out dim kind of look, so it's functional, but I really wouldn't recommend it. So there you have it. It is possible and even pretty easy to run Guild Wars 2 on other platforms. Let me know in the comments if you run Guild Wars 2 on an unconventional setup, and if this video helped you or you enjoyed it anyway, please leave a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching.